I've lived long enough to notice something about small towns. Folks remember everything, every debt, every stumble, every whisper from years back. But they forget just as easy. They forget the soup a woman brought when their children were sick. They forget the quiet years of showing up when nobody was watching. I saw it happen once, in a town called Elk Hollow. On the day of the harvest auction, the auctioneer's voice died mid-word. Clara Holloway stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Albert Pemberton lift her apple pie, the same recipe she'd brought for 12 years, and call for bids. Nothing. No hands rose. No voices spoke. Just the shuffle of boots and the creak of floorboards as people found somewhere else to look. Mrs. Hargrove's whisper carried from the back row. Some women know how to land on their feet. Others just fall. The room heard. No one corrected her. Clara's fingers dug into the fabric of her skirt. 3 years she'd kept that farm running after Henry passed. 3 years of walking into this town with her chin level and her debts unpaid. Pemberton cleared his throat. "Do I hear any bit at all?" Silence. Then the back door opened. If you've ever stood in a room where silence cut deeper than words, you know what Clara felt right then. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you've been enjoying these stories, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. It means more than you know. Boot heels on hardwood. Slow. Deliberate. Clara turned with everyone else. A man stood in the doorway. Trail dust coating his leather coat. Hat held loose in one hand. He wasn't from Elk Hollow. That much was clear from the way he moved unhurried, like a man who'd spent too many years with no one to answer to. The murmurs died. He walked forward. People stepped aside without being asked. His boots left faint prints on the sawdust floor, and Clara caught the smell of pine smoke and horse sweat as he passed within arm's reach. He didn't look at her. Didn't look at anyone. Pemberton cleared his throat. "Sir, we're in the middle of—" The stranger reached into his coat. 3 silver dollars emerged. He placed them on the auction table, one at a time. Clink, clink, clink. The sound cut through the room like a blade on stone. "Triple," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space the way a church bell fills a valley. "For the pie," he paused, let the silence stretch. "And for the shame." Mrs. Hargrove's mouth opened. "Now see here. You can't just—" "I just did." He picked up Clara's pie, her mother's cloth, her own 2 hands. 12 years of showing up when nobody wanted her there, and tucked it under his arm, like it belonged to him now. Then he tipped his hat. Not to Pemberton, not to Mrs. Hargrove. To her. Clara's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. The stranger turned and walked out the way he'd come in. The back door swung shut behind him, and the auction hall stayed frozen. Pemberton with his jaw slack. Mrs. Hargrove's face gone blotchy red. The young farmer's wife still gripping her husband's wrist where she'd pulled it down. Nobody moved. Clara's feet did. She was halfway to the door before her mind caught up. Behind her, Mrs. Hargrove's voice rose sharp and shrill. "Well, if that isn't the most—" But the words dissolved into nothing as Clara pushed through the door and stepped into the afternoon light. The stranger was already at the hitching post, untying a dun-colored horse. "Wait!" Clara called out. Her voice came sharper than she intended. He paused, looked over his shoulder. "Why?" The words scraped out of her throat. "Why did you do that?" "Wrong is wrong," he said. "Don't need to know a person to see that." Clara's hands found her hips. The afternoon sun threw long shadows across the dirt street. And somewhere behind her, The auction hall had erupted into muffled voices, scandalized, curious, hungry for something to talk about besides the weather and the price of wheat. "You made a fool of yourself in there," she said. "And me." The stranger finished untying his horse. The animal was well kept, but not fancy a working man's horse, built for mountain trails and long silences. He ran a hand along its neck before turning to face her fully. "Didn't see it that way." "What did you see?" His eyes held hers. Up close, she could see the lines around them, not old, but weathered. A man who squinted into too many sunrises and slept under too many open skies. A room full of people who forgot how to act right, he said. And one woman who didn't run. The words landed somewhere in Clara's chest, in a place she'd learned to keep locked. She looked away toward the town hall, where faces had appeared in the windows. Watching. "They'll talk," she said. "They're already talking." "They were talking before I walked in. Least now they got something worth saying." He swung up onto his horse, the pie still tucked under one arm. Clara expected him to ride off back to wherever he'd come from, back to a life that had nothing to do with Elk Hollow or its small cruelties. But he paused, looking down at her from the saddle. "I'm camped past the creek," he said. "Edge of the meadow, where the pines start. About an hour's ride from here. If you want answers, I reckon you'll have to come get them." He clicked his tongue. The horse started forward at an easy walk. Clara stood in the street, the autumn wind pulling at her hair. Behind her, the auction hall door opened. She heard Mrs. Hargrove's voice, sharp and carrying. "Well, if she has any decency left." Clara turned and walked the other way. She found his camp where he'd set a simple setup at the meadow's edge, where the grass gave way to pine and the creek ran cold and clear over smooth stones. A buckboard wagon sat unhitched, its canvas cover rolled back to show a bedroll, a coffee pot, and the organized clutter of a man who lived mostly alone. He'd already started a small fire. The pie sat on the wagon gate, still wrapped in her mother's cloth. "Took you longer than I figured," he said without looking up. "I don't make a habit of following strange men into the woods." "Smart woman?" He fed a stick into the flames. "Sit, if you want. Or don't. Your choice." Clara looked at the wagon gate, at the pie, at this man whose name she didn't even know. She sat. "Jesse Carver," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Run cattle in the high country, north of here. Come to town twice a year, spring and fall. Buy supplies. Sell what I don't need. Go back up. That's it. That's it. And today, you just happen to walk into the harvest auction and throw $3 at a stranger's pie." He was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire. Sparks rose and disappeared into the fading light. "I was passing the hall," he said. "Heard the quiet. That kind of quiet, it don't belong in a room full of people. So I looked in, and I saw what I saw." He glanced at her. "You want to eat this pie or just stare at it? I paid triple. Be ashamed to waste it." He pulled a bone-handled knife from his belt, unwrapped the cloth, and cut into the pie with practiced hands. The apples inside were golden, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. Her mother's recipe, exactly as she'd made it since she was 16 years old. He slid a slice onto a tin plate and handed it to her. Clara took it. The plate was dented, the fork tarnished, but the first bite tasted the same as it always did, like autumn mornings in her mother's kitchen, like the first year of her marriage, when everything still seemed possible For a long moment, neither spoke. The creek murmured over stones. A bird called somewhere in the pines. The fire crackled and popped, sending small sparks into the darkening air. Then Jesse cut himself a slice and ate it standing, leaning against the wagon wheel. "Good pie," he said finally. "I know." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Clara Holloway," she said. 5 miles east of town. Apple orchard. It was my husband's. He passed? 3 years now. She kept her eyes on the pie, on the golden apples and the flaky crust. "Logging accident? A tree fell wrong." Jesse didn't offer condolences, didn't say he was sorry. He just nodded, slow and steady, like he understood that some griefs don't need words piled on top of them. "My wife was Sarah," he said after a while. "Fever took her. 7 years back." Clara looked up. His face was turned toward the fire, the flames throwing shifting shadows across his jaw. "I'm sorry," she said. "So was I." He took another bite of pie, chewed, swallowed. "Still am, most days. But the world keeps turning whether you're ready or not." The sun had dropped behind the mountains. The air was cooling fast, carrying the smell of pine and wood smoke and the first hint of frost to come. Clara knew she should go. Her cow needed milking. The chickens needed feeding. And every minute she spent here was another minute of gossip being spun back in town. But she didn't move. "Why'd you really do it?" she asked. The truth this time, not some line about wrong and right. Jesse was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher, like the words had to climb up from somewhere deep. "Because 7 years ago, I buried my wife in a town that didn't care enough to send flowers. And I made myself a promise that if I ever saw somebody else standing alone like that, really alone, the way that hurts down to the bone, I wouldn't walk past." He looked at her then. Really looked. "That good enough for you?" Clara's throat tightened. She set down her plate on the wagon gate beside her. "Where's your farm?" he asked. She told him before she could think better of it. The road past the creek, the apple trees that lined the drive, the farmhouse with the blue shutters. Henry had painted the year they married. Jesse nodded once, his eyes still on hers. "I'll come by before I head back to the mountains, if that's all right." The words hung in the air between them, an offer, a question, something that hadn't existed an hour ago. Clara stood, brushed off her skirt, picked up her mother's cloth, now empty of everything except crumbs and the faint smell of cinnamon. "It's all right," she said. She walked back toward the creek, toward the road, toward the farm that had felt so empty for 3 years. Behind her, she heard Jesse banking the fire for the night, settling his horse, moving through the quiet routines of a man who'd learned to live alone. She didn't look back. But halfway across the meadow, she realized her hands had stopped shaking for the first time all day. 4 days passed. Clara told herself she wasn't watching the road, but every time she carried water from the well, her eyes drifted toward the place where the dirt track emerged from the tree line. Every time she hung laundry on the wire behind the house, she paused longer than necessary, listening for hoofbeats that didn't come. On the morning of the 5th day, She was in the orchard when the sound reached her, the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves on packed earth. She climbed down from the ladder, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the edge of the trees. Her heart beat faster than it should have. Jesse Carver's wagon rolled up the road, his dun horse pulling steady. He'd cleaned up some since she'd last seen him. The trail dust was gone from his coat, and his hat sat straighter on his head. But his face was the same, weathered, quiet, impossible to read. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the fence and climbed down. "Mrs. Holloway?" "Mr. Carver." They stood there for a moment, 10 feet apart, the autumn sun throwing long shadows through the apple trees. "Heard you got good apples," he said. "Thought I'd buy some for the trail." Clara crossed her arms. "That's so. That's so." "You rode 5 miles to buy apples you could get at Pemberton's store for half the trouble." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Pemberton's apples got no character. Too perfect. I like the ones with a few bruises, means they lived a little." Clara studied him. His hands hung loose at his sides. His shoulders were relaxed. But something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe, or hope, told her he hadn't come all this way for fruit. "You want apples," she said. "You'll help pick them." She put him to work on the east side of the orchard, where the oldest trees grew. Henry had planted them the year they married 12 years ago now, when the world had seemed full of time and possibility. The trunks had thickened, the branches had spread, and the apples hung heavy and red in the late September sun. Jesse moved through the rows with an ease that surprised her. He wasn't a farmer, that much was clear from his calluses, which came from rope and leather, not hoe and plow. But he understood labor. He climbed the ladder without hesitation, filled baskets without complaint, and worked in the comfortable silence of a man who'd spent years with no one to talk to. Clara worked alongside him. At first, they said nothing, just the rustle of leaves, the thud of apples into wicker baskets, the distant call of crows in the cornfield beyond the fence. Then, slowly, conversation came. "Where you from?" she asked, reaching for a high branch. "Originally, Montana, little town called Dillon. You wouldn't have heard of it." "I haven't heard of most places." "Neither had I, till I started riding." He descended the ladder with a full basket, set it beside the others. "Left when I was 19, worked cattle drives, mostly, Wyoming, Colorado, down into New Mexico once. Ended up in the high country about 10 years back, alone." He was quiet for a moment, adjusting the ladder against the next tree. "Not at first," he said. "Sarah and I had a place. Small cabin, nothing fancy. She liked the quiet. Said it helped her think." Clara climbed her own ladder, focused on the apples in front of her. "What happened?" "Fever. Came on fast one day, she was fine. Next day she couldn't stand. I rode for a doctor. But by the time I got back..." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Clara pulled an apple from its stem. The skin was cool against her palm, smooth and firm. "Henry was chopping wood," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. "I heard the shout from the kitchen. By the time I ran out there..." She stopped. Her throat had gone tight. Below her, Jesse stood with one hand on the ladder. He didn't say anything. Didn't offer comfort or platitudes. He just waited. "The tree fell wrong," Clara said finally. "That's what the men said. Just fell wrong. Like it was nobody's fault. Like that was supposed to make it better." She climbed down. Her hands were trembling slightly, so she busied them with the basket, rearranging apples that didn't need rearranging. Jesse picked up his own basket and carried it to the wagon without a word. They worked until the sun began to drop toward the mountains. The baskets filled. The ladders moved from tree to tree. Conversation came in pieces where Clara had grown up Ohio, a farm much like this one, how she and Henry had met a church social in Cheyenne back in 1875, what he'd been like as a husband, good man, bad with money, better with his hands than his words. "You always this quiet?" Clara asked at one point, handing him a clay jug of water. Jesse drank, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Mostly. Must make for lonely company." He looked at her then, something shifting behind his eyes. "Didn't used to be," he said. "Sarah did the talking for both of us." The words hung in the air. Clara took the jug back, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. Neither acknowledged it. As the light turned golden, Jesse carried the last basket to the wagon. Clara walked to the porch, intending to fetch payment whatever was fair for a day's work and a bushel of apples. But when she turned back, Jesse wasn't at the wagon. He was at the fence. The split-rail fence that ran along the property's south edge had been falling apart for 2 years. One rail had come loose entirely, sagging into the grass. Clara had meant to fix it a dozen times, but there was always something more urgent: a leaking roof, a sick cow, a stretch of bad weather that wouldn't let up. Jesse had already pulled the loose rail free. He was examining the post, testing its stability with one hand. "You don't have to," Clara started. "Got a hammer, nails." She brought them. Watched as he worked efficient, unhurried. Like a man who'd repaired 100 fences and could repair 100 more. The hammer struck with a steady rhythm. The nails bit into fresh wood. The rail found its place. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at his work. Then he looked at her. Neither said thank you. Neither needed to. He loaded a basket of apples into his wagon payment for the day's work. Clara insisted, though he tried to refuse. "I'll come back," he said, climbing onto the wagon seat. "Before I head to the mountains, if that's all right." Clara stood on the porch, arms wrapped against the cooling air. The kerosene lamp behind her cast a warm glow through the window. And for a moment, just a moment, the farmhouse didn't feel quite so empty. "It's all right," she said. Jesse clicked his tongue. The horse started forward, and the wagon wheels creaked as they found the ruts in the road. Clara watched until he disappeared into the tree line, until the sound of wheels faded into the evening chorus of crickets and wind. Then she went inside, lit the stove, and started supper. She was halfway through chopping carrots when she realized she was humming a hymn her mother used to sing, something she hadn't thought about in years. She stopped, stood still, listened to the silence of the house, the same silence that had pressed against her for 3 years. The same silence that had made her forget what it felt like to share a day with someone. It was still there. But tonight, somehow, it didn't feel quite so heavy. The next morning, Clara found a folded paper tucked under a stone on her porch. She hadn't heard him come, hadn't heard him leave. She unfolded the note. The handwriting was rough, the letters uneven, a man who wrote rarely and read less. "The fence should hold through winter. If it don't, I'll fix it again." Clara read it twice, 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. Next to the handkerchief she'd carried since her mother passed, she was still standing there, her hand pressed against the pocket, when she heard hoofbeats on the road not from the west, where Jesse had gone, but from the east. From town? The rider wasn't Jesse. Clara's hand found the porch rail, steadying herself against a disappointment she hadn't expected to feel. The horse that emerged from the tree line was a gray mare, not a dun gelding, and the figure in the saddle was smaller, younger. A woman in a blue calico dress with her bonnet pushed back to show a face Clara recognized. Lily Sutter, the girl from Pemberton's store, the one who'd almost raised her hand at the auction, then didn't. Lily pulled the mare to a stop near the fence and climbed down with the awkward grace of someone who rode rarely. Her hands twisted in her skirt as she approached the porch. "Mrs. Holloway." "Miss Sutter." They stood there, the morning sun casting long shadows across the yard. Somewhere in the orchard, a crow called. Clara waited. "I came to warn you," Lily said. The words tumbled out fast, like she'd been holding them the whole ride. "About what they're saying in town." Clara's jaw tightened. "I can imagine what they're saying. It's worse than you think." Lily glanced back toward the road, as if expecting pursuit. "Mrs. Hargrove has been telling everyone that you and that stranger that you've been—" She stopped, her cheeks flushing red. "Been what?" Lily couldn't meet her eyes. "Carrying on, improper-like. She says he's been out here every other day. Says a decent widow wouldn't—" "He's been here twice," Clara said, her voice flat. "To buy apples. And to help with the harvest." "I know that." Lily's voice cracked. "I know, Mrs. Holloway. But they don't care what's true. They just care what sounds good when they're gathered around Mrs. Hargrove's parlor with their tea and their—" She stopped herself, drew a breath. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't speak ill." Clara studied the girl. Lily Sutter couldn't be more than 24, 25. Young enough to still believe that fairness was something the world owed you. Old enough to be learning otherwise. "Why did you come all this way to tell me—" Lily was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Because I should have bid on your pie. I wanted to. I had the money in my pocket, 50 cents. Enough to start the bidding, and I just stood there." She finally looked up, and Clara saw that her eyes were wet. "I stood there with my hand halfway up and let them do that to you. And I've been sick about it ever since." Clara's throat tightened. She remembered that moment, the silence, the shuffling feet, the way the room had become a single creature with a single purpose. To remind her that she didn't belong. And somewhere in that room, this girl had wanted to speak and hadn't. "It takes courage to come out here," Clara said quietly. "More than it would have taken to raise your hand." Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't feel courageous. I feel like a coward who waited too long. You're here now." The words hung between them. Lily sniffled, then reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something. It's not much, just some ribbon and a bit of lace. I don't know what I thought. That maybe you could use it for something." Clara took the bundle. The paper was warm from Lily's pocket, and through it she could feel the soft texture of fabric. "Thank you," Lily nodded, already backing toward her horse. "I should go. Uncle Albert doesn't know I took the mare. He'll worry. Miss Sutter." Lily paused, one foot in the stirrup. "If it gets hard," Clara said, "standing up when no one else, does you find a way to live with yourself? That's all any of us can do." The girl's face crumpled for just a moment. Then she mounted the mare, gathered the reins, and rode back down the road toward town. Clara watched until she disappeared into the trees. Then she went inside, set Lily's gift on the kitchen table, and tried not to think about Mrs. Hargrove's parlor and the poison being poured into willing ears. Jessie came back that afternoon. Clara heard the wagon, before she saw it the familiar creak of wheels, the steady rhythm of hooves. She was in the orchard again, halfway up a ladder, when he appeared at the end of the row. "Thought you were heading to the mountains," she said without climbing down. "Changed my mind." He set his hat on a fence post, rolled up his sleeves. "Figured you could use another pair of hands. I've managed 3 years without help." "I know." He picked up an empty basket, studied the nearest tree. "But managing ain't the same as living." Clara didn't answer. She reached for an apple, twisted it from the stem, dropped it into the basket hanging from her ladder. Jessie started on the next tree. They worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that had grown comfortable between them, the kind that didn't need filling with words just to prove someone was there. "Had a visitor this morning," Clara said finally. "That so?" "Lily Sutter." "From Pemberton's store." Jessie glanced over his shoulder. "She the young one. Brown hair. Looks like she's scared of her own shadow." "That's her." Clara climbed down, moved her ladder to the next tree. "She came to warn me about what they're saying in town." Jessie's hands stilled on the apple he'd been picking. "What are they saying? What do you think they're saying?" Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended. "A widow. A strange man. Nobody's business, but everybody's favorite topic." She stopped, breathed, steadied herself against the ladder. "I'm sorry," she said. "That wasn't fair. It's not your fault." "Might be partly my fault." Jessie set down his basket, walked over to where she stood. "I knew what it would look like. Me coming out here. I did it anyway." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light filtered through the apple leaves, casting shifting patterns on the ground between them. "Because I've spent 7 years not doing much of anything," he said. "Not helping, not hurting, just existing, getting by. And when I walked into that auction hall and saw what they were doing to you..." He stopped, shook his head. "Something woke up. Something I thought I'd buried with Sarah." Clara looked at him, really looked. At the lines around his eyes, the gray threaded through his hair, the way his hands hung loose at his sides like he didn't quite know what to do with them. "I know what that's like," she said. "Burying parts of yourself, thinking they're gone for good." "Are they?" The question was quiet, direct, the kind of question that deserved an honest answer. "I don't know," Clara said. "I thought so. Now I'm not so sure." They stood there, close enough to touch, neither moving. The wind rustled through the orchard, carrying the smell of ripe apples and distant wood smoke. Then Jessie stepped back, picked up his basket, and returned to work. "Better finish before dark," he said. "Storm coming in a few days. Want to get the harvest in before it hits." Clara watched him for a moment longer. Then she climbed her ladder and reached for the next apple. They worked until the sun dropped behind the mountains. As the light faded, Jessie loaded the last of the baskets into his wagon. Clara brought out 2 cups of coffee, the real stuff, not the stretched grounds she'd been using, and they sat on the porch steps, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to deep blue. "That girl," Jessie said after a while. "Lily. She brave enough to stand up if it comes to that. I don't know, she wants to be. Wanting's a start." Clara sipped her coffee. It was still bitter, but the warmth felt good against the evening chill. "You should know," she said, "that me talking to you, you being here, it's going to make things harder. For me, I mean, in town. I know. And you're still here. Jesse turned to look at her. In the fading light, his eyes were more gray than green. I spent 7 years running from everything that reminded me of what I lost, he said. Mountains, solitude. Nobody to answer to. I told myself that was peace. But it wasn't. It was just a slower way of giving up. He set down his cup, rose to his feet. I don't know what this is, Clara. Don't know where it goes. But I know I'm tired of running, and I know I'd rather be here, with whatever trouble comes, than back up in those mountains alone. Clara stood too. They faced each other in the dusk, the porch lamp casting a warm glow through the window behind them. I need to go to town tomorrow, she said. Supplies? Can't put it off any longer. Want me to come with you? No. She shook her head. That would only make it worse. This is something I have to face on my own. Jesse nodded slowly. All right. But I'll be here when you get back. If you want me to be. I want you to be. The words came out before she could second-guess them. Jesse's expression didn't change. But something in his posture shifted, a loosening, like a rope that had been pulled too tight for too long. Then I'll be here. He climbed onto his wagon, gathered the reins. Clara watched him go until the darkness swallowed the road and the sound of wheels faded into the night. Then she went inside, banked the fire, and lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind move through the orchard. Tomorrow she would face the town, face Mrs. Hargrove, face whatever had been planted in her absence. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel like she was facing it alone. The next morning, Clara dressed in her second-best dress, the blue one with the white collar, and pinned her hair with extra care. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her dresser and saw a woman with color in her cheeks, a woman who looked almost hopeful. She took the wagon into town. 5 miles wasn't far, but she needed it to carry supplies back, and walking would have taken too long. The road wound through fields gone gold with autumn, past farmhouses where smoke curled from chimneys, past the creek where Jesse had made his camp. His wagon wasn't there anymore. He'd moved closer to her place, setting up in the meadow at the edge of her property, close enough to help, far enough to be proper. Or so they'd thought. The town of Elk Hollow looked the same as it always did, the same white church steeple, the same hitching posts, the same wooden sidewalks worn smooth by generations of boots. But something in the air had changed. Clara felt it the moment she climbed down from her wagon and tied the horse to the rail outside Pemberton's store. 2 women she recognized from church stood on the sidewalk across the street. They stopped talking when they saw her, didn't wave, didn't nod, just watched. Clara straightened her shoulders and walked inside. The bell above the door jangled. The store smelled of pickles and sawdust, and the faint sweetness of penny candy in the glass jars along the counter. Lily Sutter stood behind the register, arranging bolts of fabric on the shelf behind her. Her eyes went wide when she saw Clara. Mrs. Holloway. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. I didn't expect. I need flour, salt, lamp oil. Clara pulled her list from her pocket, though she knew every item by heart. And a pound of coffee, if you have it. Yes, ma'am. Right away. Lily moved quickly, her hands fluttering over the shelves. Clara kept her eyes forward, watching the girl work, trying not to notice the way Lily's gaze kept darting toward the window. The bell jangled again. Clara didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The scent reached her first lavender and something cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. Then the voice. Well, well. Mrs. Eunice Hargrove stood in the doorway. Flanked by two women Clara recognized, Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Greer, both of them looking anywhere but at Clara's face. They were audience, not participants. They knew their role. Clara Holloway, out in public. Mrs. Hargrove moved closer. Her black dress rustled with each step widow's weeds, though her second husband had been dead for 8 years. I'd have thought you'd be too busy entertaining to do your own shopping. Clara turned then, slowly, deliberately. Mrs. Hargrove, she kept her voice level. Something I can help you with. Help me. Mrs. Hargrove's laugh was thin, brittle. Oh, I don't need help, dear. I'm not the one who needed a stranger to buy my pie. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Clara felt them settle in her chest. That stranger, Clara said, paid fair price for fair goods. More than can be said for some folks in this room. Mrs. Hargrove's smile didn't waver. Fair price? Is that what we're calling it now? A man rides in from the mountains, throws money around like it grows on trees, and suddenly he's spending his days at your farm. He's helped with the harvest. That's all. That's all. Mrs. Hargrove glanced at her companions, eyebrows raised. Did you hear that? Ladies, the harvest? How very agricultural. Mrs. Patterson coughed. Mrs. Greer studied the floor. Clara's hands curled at her sides. She forced them to relax. I don't know what you think you know, Eunice, but whatever stories you've been telling yourself and everyone else, they're just that, stories. Stories. Mrs. Hargrove stepped closer. Her perfume was stronger now, almost suffocating. I'll tell you what's a story. Clara, a woman alone on a farm she can't afford, with debts her dead husband left behind, suddenly getting visits from a man nobody knows. That's not a story. That's something else entirely. The room had gone silent. Even Lily had stopped moving, a bag of flour clutched in her hands, her knuckles white against the paper. Clara met Mrs. Hargrove's gaze and held it. Henry's been gone 3 years, she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. 3 years I've kept that farm running on my own. 3 years I've walked into this town with my head up, paid my bills when I could, asked for credit when I couldn't, and never not once took charity from anyone. She paused. Let the silence stretch. How long was it after your first husband passed, Eunice? Before you remarried? 6 months. 7. Mrs. Hargrove's face went red. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. For just a moment, a flicker so brief, Clara almost missed it. Something crossed her face. Something that looked almost like pain. Then it was gone. That was different, Mrs. Hargrove said. That was proper. I did what a woman in my position, you did what you had to do. So am I. Clara turned to Lily, who stood frozen behind the counter. How much do I owe? Lily's hands shook as she tallied the items. 60? 63 cents, ma'am. Clara counted out the coins and placed them on the counter. She gathered her goods flour, salt, lamp oil, coffee, and tucked them into the basket she'd brought. Then she walked to the door. She didn't run, didn't hurry. Each step was measured, deliberate. Her boots striking the wooden floor with a sound like a heartbeat. Behind her, Mrs. Hargrove's voice rose sharp. Walk away, then. That's what you do best, isn't it? Walking away from anything that requires you to face the truth about yourself. Clara pushed open the door. The bell jangled. The autumn air hit her face cool, clean, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. She walked. Past the hitching post where her wagon waited, past the church with its white steeple pointing toward heaven, past the smithy where the clang of hammer on anvil rang out steady as a pulse. She climbed onto her wagon, took the reins, and drove out of town without looking back. The farmhouse was quiet when she arrived. Clara unhitched the horse, led her to the stable, and went through the motions of putting away supplies. Flour in the bin, salt in the cellar, lamp oil by the door, coffee on the table. Then she walked to the porch. She sat on the top step, facing west, watching the sun drop toward the mountains. The light was golden, warm, the kind of light that usually made her feel at peace. Today it just felt empty. Mrs. Hargrove's words echoed in her head. Mountain trash, debts, something else entirely. And that flicker on Eunice's face when Clara had mentioned her first husband. That brief crack in the armor. What was that Clara wrapped her arms around herself? The evening chill was settling in, but she didn't move to go inside. She thought about lighting the lamp, decided against it. She thought about starting supper, decided against that too. She just sat there as the light faded, as the gold turned to purple and the purple turned to deep blue, as the first stars appeared above the mountain ridge. Mrs. Hargrove was right about one thing: Jesse would leave eventually. He'd go back to his mountains, his cattle, his life that had nothing to do with Elk Hollow or its petty wars. And then what? The question sat heavy in her chest, unanswered and unanswerable. She didn't know how long she sat there, long enough for the sky to go fully dark, long enough for her muscles to stiffen and her fingers to go numb with cold, long enough to hear the creak of wagon wheels on the road. She didn't look up, didn't move. The wagon stopped. Footsteps crossed the yard slow, careful, like someone approaching a wounded animal. Jesse's voice came from the darkness. Clara. She didn't answer. He climbed to the porch steps, sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm near hers. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Jesse said quietly, "Pemberton rode out to find me. Told me what happened at the store." Clara's throat tightened. "What exactly did he tell you?" "Enough." Jesse paused. "Mom," said Mrs. Hargrove, "was unkind." Unkind. The word came out flat. "That's one way to put it." Jesse was quiet for a moment. "Then you want me to go?" Clara turned to look at him. In the darkness, she could barely make out his face, just the shape of him, the outline of his shoulders, the faint glint of starlight in his eyes. "What if me being here is making things harder?" He stopped, started again. "I meant what I said, about being tired of running, but not if it costs you more than you can pay." Clara stared at him. The question she'd been asking herself all afternoon, is he worth the trouble, suddenly seemed very small, very far away. "Stay," she said. The word came out hoarse, barely a whisper. "You sure?" "No." She shook her head. "I'm not sure of anything. But I know I don't want to sit on this porch alone anymore." Jesse didn't say anything. He just reached over, found her hand in the darkness, and held it. They sat there together as the night deepened around them. Two people who had forgotten what it felt like to not be alone. And somewhere in the distance, Clara heard hoofbeats again, not from the west this time, but from the east, getting closer, The hoofbeats belonged to Pemberton's boy, a gangly youth of 16 who delivered messages for a nickel and never asked questions. He handed Clara a folded paper, tipped his cap, and rode back into the darkness without a word. Clara unfolded it by the light from the window. The handwriting was neat, precise, a woman's hand. Mrs. Holloway, the church deacons have called a meeting for Sunday after service. Your name has been raised concerning matters of conduct. Your presence is requested. Mrs. E. Hargrove. Secretary Clara read it twice. The paper trembled in her fingers. "What is it?" Jessie asked. She handed it to him, watched his face as he read by the dim light spilling from the farmhouse. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped near his temple. "They're putting you on trial," he said quietly. "Without calling it that." Clara took the paper back, folded it carefully, set it on the porch rail beside her. "I should go," Jessie said. "What?" "Tonight. Now." Yin. He stood, his shadow stretching long across the porch boards. "If I'm gone, they've got nothing to hold against you. Just rumors. Rumors fade." Clara stared up at him. "You're running. I'm protecting you. I don't need protecting." "Clara, I spent 3 years not needing anyone." Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her hand against her mouth, forced herself to breathe. 3 years. And now you show up. And suddenly I remember what it's like to have someone in my corner. And you want to disappear. Leave me to face them alone. Jessie's hands hung at his sides. In the darkness, she couldn't read his expression. "If I stay," he said, "they'll destroy you. They're already trying. It'll get worse." "Then let it get worse." Clara stood, faced him. "I'm tired of being careful. Tired of walking on eggshells around people who decided 3 years ago that I wasn't worth their time. If they want to drag me in front of the whole church, let them. At least I'll know where I stand." Jessie was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You don't mean that." "Don't tell me what I mean." She pushed past him, went inside, and let the door swing shut behind her. She didn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through the orchard. At some point she heard Jessie's wagon creak. He was leaving, probably, going back to his camp. Putting distance between them like she'd practically demanded. Good. Let him go. Except it wasn't good. It was the opposite of good. It was the worst thing she could imagine. And she'd been the one to push him away. Around midnight, she got up, pulled on her work dress, the old one, patched and faded, the one she wore for mucking stalls and digging potatoes. She lit a lantern and walked out into the orchard. The trees stood silent in the darkness, their branches heavy with unpicked fruit. Henry's trees, Henry's dream, Henry's debt that she was still paying, 3 years after they'd lowered him into the ground. She walked to the edge of the property, where the land sloped down toward the creek. The ground was soft here, it had rained last week, and the soil hadn't fully dried. Her boots sank with each step. On the kitchen table, the letter from the land agent in Cheyenne sat unopened. She'd sent an inquiry weeks ago, asking about selling. The reply had arrived yesterday. She hadn't had the courage to read it. Maybe she should. Maybe selling was the answer. Take whatever they offered. Pay off Henry's debts. Leave Elk Hollow forever. Start over somewhere else, Denver. Maybe. Or California. Somewhere nobody knew her name or her history or the sound of her husband's casket being lowered into Wyoming dirt. The ground dipped suddenly. Clara's foot slipped. She went down hard, hands first, then knees. Then the whole length of her body sliding into the muddy hollow where the creek had overflowed its banks. The lantern flew from her grip, sputtered once, and went out. Darkness. Cold. Mud soaking through her dress, her stockings, her hair. The smell of rot and wet earth filling her nose. Clara lay there for a moment, stunned. Then she tried to push herself up, and her hands sank deeper past her wrists, past her forearms. The mud thick and black and pulling at her like it wanted to swallow her whole. She struggled, kicked, felt her boots fill with cold water. Her dress was ruined. Her dignity was ruined. Everything she'd built in 3 years, the careful composure, the straight spine, the chin held level, all of it dissolved in this moment, in this hollow, in this black mud that sucked at her body like a living thing. She stopped struggling, lay still. The mud was cold against her cheek. The smell filled her nose, earth and decay and fallen apples rotting somewhere nearby. This is what you are, she thought. This is what you've always been. A woman in the mud, pretending to be something better. She didn't know how long she lay there. Long enough for the cold to seep into her bones. Long enough for the stars to wheel overhead. Indifferent and eternal. Then she heard footsteps. Clara, Jesse's voice. Close. Concerned. She didn't answer. Couldn't. The footsteps came closer. A lantern swung into view, warm light cutting through the darkness, illuminating the hollow, the mud, the woman lying in it like something broken and discarded. Clara. Jesse set down the lantern and knelt at the edge of the hollow. His face went pale. Are you hurt? She shook her head, tried to speak. What came out was something between a laugh and a sob. I fell, she said. I fell and I can't. Her voice broke. Jesse didn't hesitate. He stepped into the mud boots, trousers, coat, and all, and reached down. His hands found her arms, gripped tight, and pulled. The mud released her with a wet, sucking sound. He hauled her up against his chest, one arm around her waist, the other steadying her shoulders. She was shaking from cold, from exhaustion, from the sheer humiliation of being found like this. I've got you, he said. I've got you. He half carried her out of the hollow, up the slope, back toward the farmhouse. Her legs didn't want to work. Her hands left muddy prints on his shirt. At the well, he pumped water into a bucket, soaked his bandana, and wiped the worst of the mud from her face and hands. His movements were gentle, careful, like he'd done this before, cleaned up someone who'd lost their footing, their composure, their pride. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. For what? For... She gestured at herself. The mud, the mess, the whole pathetic picture. For this, for pushing you away, for all of it. Jesse wrung out the bandana, dipped it in the bucket again. You know what I thought, he said quietly. When I saw you at that auction, standing there while the whole room looked away, Clara shook her head. I thought that woman knows what it's like to fall, and she's still standing. He met her eyes. Falling ain't the shame, Clara. Staying down is... She stared at him. Water dripped from her hair, her dress, her fingertips. I was halfway to the mountain pass, he said, packed and gone, made it to the ridge before I turned around. Why, because I realized I wasn't running from trouble. He set down the bandana. I was running from the first person in 7 years who made me want to stay. The words hung between them. Clara's throat tightened. She reached for his hand, muddy, cold, trembling, and he took it. Sunday, she said. The church meeting. I know. Will you be there? Jessie's grip tightened on her fingers. Try and stop me. They sat on the porch until dawn, wrapped in blankets Clara had pulled from the cedar chest. She changed into dry clothes while Jessie made coffee on her stove the first time he'd been inside the house. When she came back out, he handed her a cup, and they watched the sky lighten together. Neither spoke much. There wasn't much that needed saying. The sun rose over the mountains, burning off the mist that clung to the orchard. 2 days until Sunday. 2 days until the reckoning. Clara finished her coffee, set down the cup. I should clean up, she said. Figure out what I'm going to say to them. She stood to go inside, then stopped. On the road, coming from the east, a figure was approaching on foot. A woman in a blue dress, walking fast, her bonnet hanging loose around her neck. Lily Sutter. And even from this distance, Clara could see that something was wrong. Lily reached the fence gasping for breath. Her face was flushed, her hair escaping from its pins, her dress damp with sweat despite the morning chill. Mrs. Holloway. She gripped the fence rail, steadying herself. The meeting, they moved it. It's today. Right now, Mrs. Hargrove convinced Reverend Matthews to hold it before the regular service starts. Clara's stomach dropped. Today, she said waiting would only cause more gossip, said it was merciful to settle things quickly. Lily's eyes were wild. But it's not mercy. It's ambush. She knows you weren't expecting. I know what she knows. Clara looked at Jessie. His jaw was set, his hands curled at his sides. I'm going, Clara said. Clara. I'm going. She was already moving toward the house, toward her Sunday dress, toward whatever waited for her at that church. If they want to judge me, they can do it to my face. They arrived as the congregation was gathering. The white clapboard church sat at the center of Elk Hollow, like a judgment, rendered in wood and whitewash. Wagons lined the road. Families clustered on the lawn, their Sunday clothes crisp, their faces carefully neutral. Every head turned when Clara walked up the dirt path. She'd worn her best dress, the dark blue one with the white collar, the one she'd married Henry in. Her hair was pinned tight, her boots were clean. She looked like a woman going to her own trial and refusing to apologize for showing up. Jessie walked 3 steps behind her, not beside her that would have given Mrs. Hargrove ammunition, but close enough that everyone could see he was there. The church door stood open. Inside, the pews were already filling. Clara took a breath, squared her shoulders, and walked in. She chose a seat in the middle section, not the back, where she could hide, not the front, where she'd seem defiant, just the middle, where any ordinary woman would sit on any ordinary Sunday. The whispers started immediately. Clara kept her eyes forward, fixed on the plain wooden cross above the pulpit, fixed on the dust motes drifting in the light from the tall windows. Behind her, she heard Jessie settle into the back pew, the creak of wood, the rustle of his coat. Then the side door opened, and Ms. Hargrove entered. She was dressed in black widow's weeds, though her second husband had been dead for 8 years. The message was clear. She was the proper widow here, the respectable one, the one who'd done things the right way. She took her seat in the front row, folded her hands, waited. Reverend Matthews stepped to the pulpit. He was a thin man with watery eyes and a voice that always sounded like it was apologizing for something. He cleared his throat 3 times before speaking. Brothers and sisters, we are gathered this morning to address a matter of community concern. His eyes flickered toward Clara, then away. It has been brought to my attention that certain behaviors have caused distress among our congregation. Clara's hands tightened in her lap. Mrs. Hargrove has asked to speak on behalf of those concerned. Mrs. Hargrove rose, turned to face the congregation. Her face was composed, serene, the face of a woman who believed absolutely in her own righteousness. "Thank you, Reverend." Her voice carried clearly through the small church. "I'll be brief. We all know why we're here. We all saw what happened at the harvest auction. And we've all heard the stories since." She paused. Let the silence build. "A stranger rode into our town. A man no one knows, no one can vouch for. And within days, he was spending his time at the Holloway farm alone with a widow who, by her own admission, cannot afford to pay her debts." Murmurs rippled through the pews. Now, I'm not saying anything improper occurred. Mrs. Hargrove's smile was thin, precise. I'm simply saying that appearances matter, reputation matters, and when a woman chooses to disregard both, she puts the entire community at risk. Clara's nails dug into her palms. She could feel the half-moon indentations forming in her skin. "I move that Mrs. Holloway be formally censured by this congregation. That she be asked to sever all contact with the man called Jesse Carver. And that she be reminded," Mrs. Hargrove's voice dropped, becoming almost gentle, "that there are proper ways to conduct oneself, ways that honor the Lord, honor community, and honor the memory of those we've lost." The church was silent. Reverend Matthews looked uncomfortable. His hands twisted around each other like small animals trying to escape. "Well," he said, "does anyone wish to speak in response?" "Nothing." Clara stared straight ahead. The cross above the pulpit blurred and sharpened, blurred and sharpened. Then a chair creaked. Footsteps on the wooden floor. Clara turned. Lily Sutter stood in the aisle. Her face was pale, her hands trembling at her sides. But she was standing. She was there. "I want to speak," Lily said. Her voice shook, but it carried. Mrs. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Miss Sutter, this is hardly the time for, I want to speak." Lily's voice was stronger now. "I have something to say, and I'm going to say it." Reverend Matthews looked helplessly at Mrs. Hargrove, then at Lily, then at the congregation. "Very well, Miss Sutter, you may speak." Lily walked forward until she stood at the front of the church, facing everyone. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles white. "I was at the auction," she said. "When Mrs. Holloway's pie came up for bidding, I was standing right there by the door. I had 50 cents in my pocket, enough to start the bidding, enough to do what was right." She paused, swallowed hard. "And I stood there with my money in my hand, and I watched that room go silent, and I did nothing." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I was scared of what people would say, scared of Mrs. Hargrove and her friends and their whispers, scared of being the one person who stood up when everyone else sat down, Lily's eyes found Clara's. The shame of that day isn't Mrs. Holloway's. It's mine. And it's ours, all of ours, for letting it happen. The church had gone completely still. Not a cough, not a rustle, not a breath. Then another voice spoke. She's right. Old Mr. Garrett, 70, if he was a day, a farmer who'd known Clara's father-in-law, rose slowly from his pew. I should have bid too. Good pie, I reckon. Good woman. I knew Henry Holloway for 30 years, and I know his widow's got more spine than half the men in this room. He looked at Mrs. Hargrove. Including some of the women? A ripple went through the congregation. Then Albert Pemberton stood. I was the auctioneer, he said. His face was red, his voice rough. I could have called the bidding closed, could have bought the pie myself and saved everyone the embarrassment. But I didn't. I stood there and let it happen because... He stopped. Shook his head. Because I was a coward. Plain and simple. More voices now. Mrs. Patterson, who'd stood with Mrs. Hargrove at the store, raised her hand. I've known Clara Holloway for 10 years. Never saw her do an unkind thing. Never heard her speak ill of anyone. Even Mrs. Greer, timid Mrs. Greer, who never said anything, spoke up. She brought soup to my mother when she was sick, 3 days in a row, didn't ask for thanks, didn't ask for anything. One by one, the congregation was turning. Not all of them, not everyone, but enough. Enough that the balance was shifting. The ground was moving beneath Miss Hargrove's feet. Clara watched it happen. Her chest was tight, her eyes burning. But she didn't look away. Mrs. Hargrove stood alone at the front of the church. Her face had gone pale. Her hands, which had been folded so neatly, now gripped the pew in front of her like a lifeline. This is... Her voice faltered. This is not how... She stopped, The church waited. And something strange happened to Mrs. Hargrove's face. The mask, the careful, righteous. Certain masks she'd worn for as long as anyone could remember cracked. Her eyes went to Clara, held there. I lost my first husband when I was 26, she said. The words came out quiet, wondering, like she was hearing them for the first time herself. 26 years old, with nothing but a small house and smaller savings. I remarried within the year because I had to. Because there was no other way for a woman alone. The congregation had gone utterly still. I told myself it was the proper thing, the respectable thing. Mrs. Hargrove's voice was shaking now. But the truth is, she stopped. Her hand went to her throat. The truth is, I was terrified. I've spent 30 years being terrified that someone would see through me, see that I didn't remarry for propriety. I remarried because I was too scared to stand alone. Her eyes were wet now. Too scared to do what you did, Clara. Too scared to even try. Clara's breath caught. I think, Mrs. Hargrove said slowly, I've been punishing you for having the courage I never had. She turned to Reverend Matthews. I withdraw my motion. Then she walked down the aisle, past the staring faces, past Clara's pew, past Lily still standing frozen at the front. She pushed open the church door and stepped out into the morning light. She didn't look back. The congregation sat in stunned silence. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat, cleared it again. Well, he said, I suppose we should proceed with the regular service. Clara didn't hear the rest. She was already rising, already moving toward the door. already stepping out into the autumn air where Mrs. Hargrove stood alone on the church lawn, her back to the building, her shoulders shaking. Clara walked up behind her, stopped 3 feet away. "Mrs. Hargrove." The older woman didn't turn. Her voice came out ragged, stripped of everything it had been. "Don't. Whatever you're going to say, don't." "I wasn't going to say anything." Clara took a breath. "I was going to ask if you'd like to walk home with me, have some coffee, talk if you want, or not." Mrs. Hargrove turned then. Her face was blotched with tears, her eyes red and swollen. After everything. Clara held out her hand. "That's when it matters most." Mrs. Hargrove stared at the offered hand. Her whole body trembled. Behind them, the church door opened. Jessie emerged, followed by Lily, followed by a stream of congregants who stopped short at the sight before them. 2 women, one offering, one deciding. Mrs. Hargrove took Clara's hand. The days that followed were quiet ones. Clara returned to the rhythm of her farm, the morning milking, the afternoon harvest, the evening chores that kept her hands busy and her mind from wandering too far. The orchard still needed work. The chickens still needed feeding. The fence still needed mending in places Jessie hadn't gotten to yet. But something had shifted. She felt it in the way the air moved through the house, in the way sunlight fell across the kitchen table, in the way her own footsteps sounded on the wooden floors. The silence was still there, but it was a different kind of silence now. Less empty, more waiting. On Tuesday, Lily Sutter appeared at the gate with a basket over her arm. "Fabric scraps," she said, her cheeks pink from the walk. "Uncle Albert had some pieces left over from the last shipment. Thought you might use them for quilting, or mending, or—" She trailed off, uncertain. Clara took the basket. Inside, beneath the fabric, she found a small jar of honey and a packet of tea wrapped in brown paper. "Thank you. Lily, it's nothing. The girl twisted her hands together. "I wanted to say that what you did at the church with Mrs. Hargrove, I don't think I could have done that." "You stood up when it mattered. That took more courage than anything I did." Lily shook her head, but she was smiling a small, shy smile that made her look younger than her years. "I should go. Uncle Albert's expecting me back at the store." She turned to leave, then paused at the gate. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm glad you stayed." Clara watched her walk back down the road until she disappeared around the bend where the oaks grew thick. On Wednesday, Pemberton's boy showed up with a wagon load of fence posts. "Pa says you needed these," he said, scratching the back of his neck and looking anywhere but at Clara's face. "Said to tell you there's no charge. Says it's overdue." Clara looked at the posts, good cedar, straight-grained, the kind that would last 20 years if properly set. She looked at the boy, who was trying very hard to seem casual about the whole thing. "Tell your father thank you." "Yes, ma'am." He unloaded the posts by the barn, stacking them neat and careful, then climbed back onto the wagon seat and drove away, without another word. Clara stood in the yard for a long time, looking at the cedar posts golden in the afternoon light. On Thursday, old Mr. Garrett rode out with a jar of apple butter his wife had put up. "She said to tell you she used your recipe," he said from atop his horse. "The one you gave her last spring, when her orchard got the blight and she lost most of her crop. Said it turned out pretty good." "I remember." Mr. Garrett shifted in his saddle. He was not a man comfortable with sentiment, and his face showed it. Listen, he said. What happened at the church, I should have spoken up sooner. Should have bid on that pie when I had the chance. I knew it was wrong and what they were doing, knew it in my bones, but I sat there like a fool and let it happen. You spoke up when it counted. Counted for you, maybe. Not for me. He looked out at the orchard, at the trees heavy with fruit waiting to be picked. A man my age. You'd think I'd have learned by now, but I guess some lessons take longer than others. He touched his hat brim. You ever need anything? Mrs. Holloway, you send word. I mean that. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the main road, his figure growing smaller until the trees swallowed him up. Clara didn't trust it. Not entirely. Not yet. 3 years of silence and sideways looks had taught her that kindness could disappear as quickly as it appeared, that the same hands that offered help today might withdraw tomorrow, that the same mouths that spoke warm words could turn cold without warning. But she didn't refuse it either. She accepted Lily's fabric, Pemberton's posts, Mr. Garrett's apple butter. She nodded when people greeted her on the road. She even managed a small smile when Mrs. Patterson, who had stood with Mrs. Hargrove that day in the store, stopped by with a loaf of fresh bread and an apology that seemed, against all odds, sincere. I was wrong, Mrs. Patterson said, her eyes fixed on her own shoes. I knew it then. I know it now. I'm sorry. Clara took the bread. It was still warm from the oven, and the smell of it filled her kitchen like something she'd forgotten she was missing. Would you like some coffee? They sat on the porch and talked about nothing in particular. The weather, the harvest, the price of flour in Cheyenne. It wasn't friendship, not exactly, but it was a start. On Friday afternoon, Clara was in the orchard when she heard the creak of wagon wheels on the road. She didn't look up right away, kept her hands busy with the basket she was filling, kept her eyes on the apples, kept her breathing steady, but her heart was already lifting before she could stop it. The wagon stopped at the fence. Footsteps crossed the yard, crunching on fallen leaves. A shadow fell across her row. Heard you could use some help with the harvest. Jesse stood at the end of the row, hat in his hand, his coat brushed clean of trail dust. He looked the same as he had 2 weeks ago, weathered, quiet, impossible to read, but something in his stance had changed. Less guarded, more present. Where have you been? Clara kept her voice level. I expected you back days ago. Rode up to the ridge. Needed to think. Think about whether I could leave. He moved closer, stopping a few feet away. About whether I wanted to. Clara set down her basket, wiped her hands on her apron, and I got halfway to the pass before my horse stopped walking. The corner of his mouth twitched. Stubborn animal. Wouldn't take another step no matter what I did. Is that so? That's so? His eyes held hers. Though I suspect it wasn't the horse that was being stubborn. Clara crossed her arms. Jesse, I'm not good at this, he said. Words, feelings, any of it. Sarah used to say I could go a whole week without stringing 3 sentences together. And she was right. He took a breath. But I've been thinking, these past few days, about what I want, and I figured I better say it before I lose my nerve. He stepped closer. I've been alone for 7 years. Told myself it was what I needed. Told myself the mountains were enough, the cattle were enough, the quiet was enough. He shook his head. But it wasn't. None of it was. Clara's throat tightened. Then I walked into that auction hall. Jessie continued. Saw you standing there while everyone looked away, and something changed. Something I can't take back, even if I wanted to. He reached into her basket, pulled out an apple, turned it over in his hands, examining it like it held some secret. I don't want to go back to the mountains, Clara. Not alone. Not anymore. He bit into the apple, chewed slowly, swallowed. Good soil here, he said. A man could put down roots in soil like this. If you'd have him. Clara stared at him. At this man who'd walked into her life with $3 silver and a handful of words. At the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the way he stood there holding an apple like it was the most natural thing in the world. That an offer, it's a question. If you want it to be? She didn't answer right away. Reached over and took the apple from his hand. Bit into it herself. The juice was sweet and sharp. The taste of autumn and earth and something that might have been the beginning of something new. Stay through the harvest, she said. Help with the apples? After that, we'll see if you're still worth the trouble. Jessie's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but close enough. Fair enough. They worked until the sun dropped behind the mountains. Side by side, row by row, basket by basket. Their hands moved in easy rhythm, reaching, picking, sorting, filling. Conversation came in pieces: the weather, the trees, the fence posts Pemberton had sent, the apple butter from Mr. Garrett's wife. Small things, practical things, the kind of things two people talked about when they were learning how to share a space. As the light turned golden, Jessie carried the last basket to the wagon. Clara walked to the well, drew water, filled 2 cups. They sat on the porch steps, watching the sky change colors: gold to orange to purple to the deep blue of early evening. You ever think about what comes next? Jessie asked. Sometimes. Not as much as I used to. What changed? Clara looked at the orchard, at the trees Henry had planted, at the land she'd fought to keep for 3 years, at the land agent's letter still sitting on her kitchen table, still unopened, still waiting. I stopped waiting for the next bad thing, she said. Started looking for what might come after instead. Jessie nodded slowly, set down his cup. I'd like to be part of what comes after, if you'll let me. Clara turned to look at him. At this man who'd spent 7 years running and had finally stopped. At this man who'd spoken when no one else would. At this man who was sitting on her porch, drinking her water, asking nothing except the chance to stay. You already are, she said. The sun sank lower. The shadows lengthened across the yard. Somewhere in the orchard, a bird sang its evening song, one clear note. Then another. Then silence. Jessie reached over and took her hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, warm against her skin. They sat there together as the day ended, and the stars began to appear, one by one, above the mountain ridge. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The land agent's letter could wait. The debts could wait. The uncertain future could wait. For now, there was this 2 people on a porch, watching the light fade, holding on to something that felt like it might last. The harvest wasn't finished. The story wasn't over. But for the first time in 3 years, Clara didn't mind not knowing how it would end. There's a quiet weight that settles after a story like this one. Not heavy. Exactly. Just present. Something that sits in the chest and asks nothing except to be there for a while. Many of us know what it feels like to stand in a room full of people and feel completely invisible. Some of us have waited for someone to speak up when no one did. Others have been the one who stayed silent, carrying that weight for years afterward. Perhaps you've offered kindness to someone who hurt you not because they earned it, but because holding on was harder than letting go. Perhaps you've watched someone you judged turn into someone you understood. These things don't need to be explained. They don't need to make sense or add up to something neat. They're simply part of what it means to keep going, day after day, with a heart that's been broken and mended more times than you can count. It's all right to sit with whatever you're feeling right now. It doesn't need a name. It doesn't need to be resolved. Clara found her way. Jesse found his. And somewhere in Elk Hollow, a town remembered how to be kind again. That's enough. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening.